All right, so next up we've got Paul, who's going to tell us about how we're all like Equifax. Let's have a round of applause for Paul.
How are you guys doing today? Awesome. Thanks for coming. This looks like a great crowd. Excited to be here. So this is going to be great. So who here has not heard of Equifax? Good. Good. I'm glad to hear that. So we're all like Equifax. So, oh, there it is. Cool. What does that mean? We're all like Equifax. To me, what that means is that we're all susceptible to being breached. It's something that we're all going to be on the guard for, to watch out for. And honestly, that's not something that I want for any of you. I don't want it for my company. I don't want it for anybody else. So first of all, let's look back a little bit at what really happened with Equifax. So I think the date was March 17th of 2017. A new vulnerability was discovered. The name given to it was CVE 2017-5638. Remember that? It's important. No, you don't have to remember that. There'll be no test at the end. The challenge with it was network exploitable, medium access complexity, so it wasn't too hard to be able to make an exploit with that. No authentication was required. It allows unauthorized disclosure of information, unauthorized modification, it allows disruption of service. What does that break down to? What does that really mean? What it means is that you could take advantage of this vulnerability remotely, so you didn't have to be on the physical machine to be able to do that. Wasn't that hard to be able to do anything with that, to take advantage of that. No authentication was required, so you didn't even have to log on to the machine. It was very easy for hackers to be able to get in and do anything with that. And also, the next to last one allows unauthorized modification. What does that mean? What it ended up meaning is that the hackers were able to put a web shell onto that system and gain control of parts of that system and then be able to access other systems through that. So basically, a remote code execution vulnerability. So let's take a look. This was publicized. As you can see, the FBI sent out a Flash Bulletin. It was sent out to a large number of companies, including Equifax. The Equifax Global Threat Vulnerability team took a look at that and said, this is something we need to pay attention to. They sent out the email to about 430 different people inside of Equifax saying, this is a major security issue. We need to address it in 48 hours. Now, let me take a quick step back, a little bit more about Equifax. It's one of the credit reporting agencies in the United States. There's three major ones, I'm sure a number of not so major ones. About 2005, they went through a series of acquisitions. They acquired a whole bunch of companies. It was very profitable for them, which is what they were really looking for to be able to do with this, is to get some more visibility, gain market share with what they do and things like that. So it was really quite profitable, but in the process of doing that, they acquired a lot of different IT infrastructure from the companies that they acquired. Anybody gone through a merger or an acquisition where you brought in other? Isn't that fun, trying to bring all that new stuff in and get it all organized and all that kind of stuff? Yeah, it's basically a nightmare where you're trying to find out, how do you coordinate with what they do? How do they coordinate with what you do and how you do things? It's kind of crazy. Actually, a few weeks before the breach happened, the CEO was basically boasting that the Equifax was processing 1,000 times as much data as resides in the Library of Congress on a daily basis. So there's a lot of data going through that, a lot of systems coming from various different companies, different ways of doing things, and how all that works together. What does that lead to? A lot of complexity, right? So what happens is that this vulnerability is discovered on March 7th. The notification comes out. Equifax sends the email alert out to all the people inside their organization, inside their company, that, hey, we need to be aware of this. This is something we need to be watch out for. We need to fix this within 48 hours. Unfortunately, it didn't get to all the people that it should have gotten to. So there were some people that were responsible for some systems inside their network that did not see this and therefore did not take the corrective actions to be able to take care of that. On March 9th, they're hacked. Now, it was not an obvious hack. There was a number of reasons why it was not obvious and why it was not immediately detected. Part of it is that for about a year and before this, some of their intrusion detection systems, they had some equipment inside their network that would decrypt encrypted transactions, and therefore they could use that to be able to monitor those transactions that are taking place. Who's it going to? What's the payload inside that? Where did it come from? What are they trying to do with that? So that was down because there was an expired SSL certificate on that server. Yeah, you know, talk about a comedy of errors, right? What are you going to do with that? So that was down at that point. And so for about 2 months, if you look at that slide, what's happening is that these hackers are starting to probe. They're looking around inside the system that they got access to. They were able to find a file that had a bunch of credentials in it. That would be user IDs and passwords. They used that to then get access to other systems. They started to explore databases and found somewhere around 48 different databases that they were able to access and pull data from and put data into, you know, do a lot of transactions with that. I think they ended up hitting or executing 9,000 different transactions inside the Equifax network. And so about May, they started to say, you know, nobody's noticed us. We're running under the radar. So they started pulling a lot of data out. And I think the right term is exfiltrate. Take that data, pull it out of the databases. And this is what we now call PII data. So this is your personal information that's being exported from their controls and actually probably moved to China. I believe some of the calls were coming from China. Others came from a server in Germany, but it was leased by a company or an organization in China. So from May until about the end of July, all this is going on. So what happens? At the end of July, so this is now going on 18, 19 months of this certificate being out of date, being expired. They finally updated the certificate. And lo and behold, they then can look at all this network traffic and go, oh, this is not good. This is a bad thing. So then they were able to go and say, what's going on here? And they immediately started to lock things down, figure out what's going on, send up the alarms inside the company and start to, well, obviously move into crisis mode in management on how to handle this type of stuff. So, you know, it's a combination of different things that came together. Number one, they had a vulnerability. They didn't have a good chain of command to know who do we need to notify about this bad code out there that we need to fix. And then once they figured that out, well, I assume they figured it, at some point they did figure it out. But in the meantime, they also had something else in their infrastructure that was wrong. It was a bad expired SSL certificate that was preventing them to be able to do all their network monitoring and stuff like that. So a number of things came together to really make a bad situation even worse. Now, one of the lessons we can learn from this is that we in IT, as we're DevOps professionals, we need to be working faster. The bad guys are definitely working fast, and they're even getting even faster. So if you go back to 2006, it was about 45 days that we had between when a vulnerability was discovered and it was exploited. Between that, you know, between we discovered the issue and when hackers were starting to take advantage of that. And the time frame kind of goes up and down through that, but about 2015 or 2015, it dropped down to about 15 days, so about 2 weeks. Still had a little bit of time to be able to recover from that and be able to fix things, but then Equifax happened, and suddenly it became 3 days. Now, in some ways, I got to say thank you, Equifax, because you have done a tremendous job of bringing to the public knowledge into the foresight of the public the need for cybersecurity. Wish you hadn't have done it this way, but I'm grateful that you did bring it to people's attention. So we've got to start working faster. We've got to be able to operate faster than the bad guys, or as we sometimes say, operate faster than evil. Now, Equifax was not alone. Let's look at some of the other things that happened. So again, the vulnerability was discovered on March 7th. On March 8th, NSA discovered a lot of activity out on the network. Their scanners were being hit by vulnerability or hackers trying to take advantage of this vulnerability. Then we see Cisco on March 9th is noticing a lot of activity around this, and they're obviously notifying their customers on that. March 10th, Equifax happens. They're the ones that we think of most, right? But you can see that there are also a couple of Canadian companies or organizations that were hit by that. In Japan, there was another. So again, it was just 3 days between when it was discovered and when it started to take place. And then the rest of the story, there's another Japanese organization that was hacked and hit by that. In April 13th, the India Post was impacted. Some other things were going on here. Some crypto mining was taking place. India, another organization in India, and it continues. Even to today, we'll see a large number of companies, almost 9,000 companies, are downloading the same version of struts. So what's going on here? Well, we're taking advantage of something called open source software. Most of you are probably very familiar with that, but just in case not, I wanted to be able to talk a little bit about that and what it means for the industry. Who of us here has, as a company, has more budget to hire more people to do fewer things and make fewer releases? Yeah, crickets. That's what I was expecting. It's the other way around, isn't it? If you've got more budget, it's because you're doubling the workload of the people that they're supposed to be doing, right? Nobody's making it easier. And so we're all tasked with, how do I make these new innovations to my applications? How do I bring out new stuff? Our customers are demanding it. They're very fickle. If my website doesn't respond in, 5 to 10 seconds, they're like, I'll go hit somebody else. I'll go find another application to be able to access on that. So we've learned as an industry, we've got to move fast. We've got to innovate quickly. We've got to out-innovate our competitors. And what we see, now keep in mind, I'm with Sonatype. One of our founders helped create an application many years ago called Maven. Some of you are probably familiar with that. After he helped with that, he said, wouldn't it be cool if there was a centralized spot on the internet where people could download all these Java open source components to be able to work with that. So he and our company created what's called the Central Repository, or sometimes called Maven Central. We continue to steward that today. It's in our purview, and we can see, and for example, these type of statistics with it. So you can see that the download velocity of components from Maven Central is just skyrocketing. Same thing for NPM. Anybody here use JavaScript? Yeah, it's quite popular. A lot of people love it. So we're talking like 1,000 new projects a day, 10,000 new versions per day. And it's not a growth rate of 14%, it's 14 times, 14x annual growth. So there's a ton of growth going on out there with that. Same thing with NuGet, PyPy, everything's out there growing tremendously. And so what that ends up meaning in our research and what other people have looked at as well, in modern applications, 80 to 90% of your code is borrowed, if you will. It is utilizing or assembled of open source components. And so you're only writing 10 to 20% of that code. Interesting statistic, isn't it? So that's out there. Now, the issue is not all components are created equal. Some of them have vulnerabilities in them. Now, sometimes we don't notice that up front. We don't always see it right away. Sometimes it takes time. So anybody remember Heartbleed and Shell Shock? Those were out there for quite a while in the community before the vulnerabilities in them were finally noticed. We sometimes describe this as open source ages like milk, not like wine. It goes bad over time. So that's part of what we run into as an industry is that this isn't always good. Now, some examples. Let's look at Java. So we went off and studied about 170,000 commonly downloaded Java open source components. And we discovered about 18,000 of those have vulnerabilities. So roughly 10, 11, 12%, somewhere in there. Any guesses on JavaScript? All of them? No, not quite. About half of them. So of 60,000 commonly downloaded JavaScript components, about half of them have known vulnerabilities in them. Doesn't that just warm you, make you all excited and happy? No, it's kind of scary to think about that kind of stuff. Now, I'm not wanting to be a downer on this type of stuff, but as you look at that, there was a survey or a study that came to my attention just this week. A university, I think it was in Germany, did a study of a lot of NPM JavaScript components, the dependencies between them. And what they discovered is that the average JavaScript component has, I believe it was 79 different dependencies coming from 39 different maintainers. That's a lot of interconnectedness and going on in there. The end result of the study was that it wouldn't take much for someone to be able to infiltrate somebody else's user ID or get into one of these organizations and inject a little bit of malicious code, and it'd be very far-reaching with a lot of people. The point I take from that is you have one JavaScript developer on your payroll, you really have 40 JavaScript developers. Because that package that they're calling, on average, is going to have 79 different dependencies that it's pulling in from 39 different developers. So really, you've got 40 developers working for you. Have you checked all of their resumes? Do you know the quality of their work? Interesting thought. Interesting thought. So that leads me to another point that we often look at. We talk about cyber hygiene. Now, I'll add a little personal anecdote here. I travel a lot for the business that I do. And a few weeks back, I was on a one-night trip, came in, landed late at night, pulled out the ironing board. And one of the things that I typically do, I don't know if anybody else here travels and does this type of thing, but it's one of those things that's like, it made sense to me, and I've just picked up the habit of doing this. I pull out the ironing board, pull out the iron, heat it up, and I go and get a wet washcloth from the bathroom and iron that first. And you're going, what in the world is he talking about? Why would you do that? Well, in this particular case, it was very useful because as I ironed that washcloth, a bunch of dark brown stuff started coming off the bottom of the iron. I have no idea what the person before me did with that iron. Maybe they're making a grilled cheese sandwich or something. I don't know. But I looked at that and go, wow, that was very fortunate. I have good, if you will, hygiene in my practices in travel in that I did something that prevented what could have been a disaster because I had a meeting the next morning at 8:30. I didn't have a car. I used Uber to get to the hotel. I wouldn't have been able to go to a store to buy a new shirt. Didn't have time to go off and wash it to be able to get ready for the next day. And so I would have had, these nice, lovely iron patches all over my shirt because of what somebody else did to the iron. So the point of that is we need to be bringing in good hygiene in what we're doing in DevOps practices in our different organizations. Part of that is looking at what we download. So here, going back to this same concept of the Struts 2 vulnerability, we can see that March 17th or 7th, it was the vulnerabilities announced. The breach happened shortly after that. Then the breach was discovered about midway through the chart. Disclosed a little after that, and new struts and spring vulnerabilities were also discovered a little after that. But you can see the download activity of that same component over those 12 months. Very little variation in that. So even though it should have been something that a lot of programmers, developers, IT staff should have been very aware of, it was still being downloaded and being utilized. So how do we deal with this type of stuff? Here's another slide that I thought I'd throw in here. I thought this was a pretty cool chart. It's from a website called informationisbeautiful.net. Fun to go off and look at that. And actually, this is the top part of that. It goes back about 10 years, and it's looking at the selected number, a large number of breaches that were 30,000 data records or more. Now, as you look at this, you can see Equifax stands out, going back to 17. In this particular chart, the orange color up there really represents interesting stories. So if you click on those, it'll give you a little bit more of an interesting story about those particular organizations and what happened there. Now, these breaches, these hacks that we see here are, they include a lot of different things. So it includes, for example, loss of a device. Maybe somebody's laptop was stolen. And so they lost data that way. Or there's just, some kind of oops, if you will. Something happened, or just pure poor security, something along those lines. So let's take those out. Let's just look at the ones that are true hacks. A bad actor came in and was active in this type of environment. So here we can see it's a little bit, cleaned out some of the noise there. We can still see a lot of stuff. Equifax is obviously still in there, but there's a lot of others that do show up. Marriott Hotels, Capital One. Anybody remember a few months ago, Capital One was hacked and some stuff like that? Now, let's look a little bit differently at this data. Let's look at the data that was stolen. How bad was that? Was it really personal stuff, or was it just, maybe your username was stolen? And so here in this particular chart, again, the same actors as we were looking at before, but now the darker colors means it's more private data, more invasive data that was actually stolen. So that's one of those things that I think is good for us to be able to look at. And it's interesting here, Equifax is kind of middle of the road here. It's not the worst ones out there. There's, Marriott Hotels was a little bit darker, so a little bit more data was given out. Capital One as well. So one of the key things, though, is I don't want your name to show up here. I was talking about all the details of the Equifax breach. I picked those up by reading the congressional report about that breach. Somewhat interesting reading. I was reading it last night. I couldn't go to sleep. But it didn't really help me go to sleep because it kind of scared me, But it's kind of one of those things where I don't want your name to be one of those people that's being interviewed by a congressional committee trying to find out what happened because your organization had a breach. Anybody want to volunteer for that? I don't. So how do we avoid the mistakes that Equifax made? How do we prevent that from happening to us? Now, interestingly enough, before I signed up to and presented the idea of this talk with you guys, I didn't know I was going to be able to do this, but last week I went to an event in Atlanta with, it was an executive alliance networking type of event, and who would show up and give the keynote but Jamil Farshi. I'm not sure I got that right, so forgive me if I didn't. He's the new CISO of Equifax. So it was very interesting to have him come in and talk and explain what they've been doing differently. They've made tremendous efforts, increased, I think, their IT security spend by 4x to be able to recover from this and make sure that what happened in the past was is not repeated. These are some of the lessons that he brought up coming out of that. And I look at it and say, these are a lot of things that we can implement in a DevOps culture. As we develop that in organizations, as we continue on our journey, these are things that we can do. So some of what he talked about was variations in environments. So if you remember what I was talking about before, they had done a lot of acquisitions over time. And so they had a lot of complex systems. And if you go, I was reading through that a congressional report about it. They were talking about, we had these systems over here that did things that way, systems over on this side that did things another way, and somehow or another, all these things just kind of came together and worked. I'm like, oh, that sounds like magic. But the key thing that he brought out of that is that variations reduce the opportunity to be secure. So all these variations, how these different organizations that they acquired did things, made it more difficult for them to be able to identify what was not secure, where insecurities would take place. Visibility, know what your assets are. As they went through those acquisitions, they brought in a ton of additional equipment, new servers, new applications, all those type of things to be able to keep track of. Now, from Sonatype, what we do is we help govern open source use inside of your environment. And so that would be one of those assets you need to be able to keep track of, is where are we using these different components? I was talking to a customer several months back who, when Equifax hit, he explained what his CIO came to him and says, we want to know where we're using struts. Where do we have this vulnerability? And he had to look at his CIO and say, I don't know. So it took him about a week to download all the source code that they had written, scan through that to be able to find any issues or any references to struts 2, and then be able to report back to his CIO to say, here's where we're vulnerable. It took a week. You've got 3 days. And that's not even getting to remediation. At that point, he just knew where they were vulnerable. So know where your assets are and know what's going on there. Communication, I really like this idea because he talked about they really focus on behavior and outcomes, not necessarily on blame. I've been in too many organizations, seen it across the board, where we focus on blame. Why did this happen? Who's responsible for that? Get them out of here. That's not what we need to be doing. We need to be looking at it and saying, what happened? How can we learn from this so that we don't repeat this in the future? And several other people that spoke at this event also brought up the point that they have changed some of their measurements of their employees. And Equifax was certainly one, where everybody is being measured on security. That's a part of what they, at the end of the year, their measurement includes is aspects of security. What are you doing to help make us more secure? Anybody else have a measurement like that in their organization? I think it's a worthy idea to look at and say, what can we do to help make sure that this is part of the conversation day to day so that we're aware of these type of things? Another thing he brought up is automation. Now, in a DevOps conference, I know it's crazy. Who's using automation? Perfect. That's fantastic. Almost everybody raised their hand. That's great. Why do we do that? Well, number one, in the context of this idea, it reduces variation because you can make things happen, you can repeat them, you can see where things things are different. I loved it. I didn't have a chance to replicate his slide, but he had a slide where one half of the slide had a bunch of pluses and circles and triangles and hexagons, different colors and all that kind of stuff. The other side of the slide was almost all pluses except for one red circle. And he said, how easy is it to find the red circle on the right side, where it was mostly all pluses except for that one red circle, as opposed to the left side, which was a jumble of different things. And that really brought home that point of when you have automation, you can have that uniformity, and when something is outside of that uniformity, it really stands out. It's easy to see. And you can identify that. And to me, that goes very much back to that whole idea of variations in the environment. Well, if we're implementing DevOps practices, not only are we doing that when we're creating our code, but we're also utilizing those practices and hopefully automation as we're building out the infrastructure that we're going to deploy our applications onto. And that helps us to achieve that uniformity, that variation. It makes it very easy to see when things are the outliers that you don't want. It also increases our capacity. I asked earlier, anybody got more budget for more people? Nobody really raised their hand. So how do you get better use of the people that you've got? You automate things. You help to be able to control that or be able to scale what each person can do. Another key point that I thought he brought up was controls. And what he means by that is that we all have a lot of controls that we put into our networks, right? Into our systems. Maybe it's something like Splunk to be able to monitor logs, or as they had in their network, devices that can unencrypt the encrypted traffic so you can examine that and take a look at that. I think all too often, in reading through that report about Equifax, I saw it in there. They had what should have been a lot of good controls. They had those network systems. They ran some scans against their environment that were designed to catch where anybody might have been running that struts 2 component. I don't know why, but they didn't catch those things. And so that's why I've got up here, validate that the controls you have are working. Make sure that all that stuff is set up in place and is actually working. Don't just check a box and say, we've got network security. We've got monitoring of what our networks are doing and that kind of stuff. Dig a little deeper and make sure that it really is working. That's, I think, a very key thing to do there. Now, let's dig a little deeper. I want to look more at open source. I've talked a lot about that, how Equifax is using it, how it's very prevalent and spread out throughout our whole industry. I think DevOps and Agile have taken a lot of ideas from Deming, who was a kind of a lean manufacturing guy. He helped revitalize the manufacturing industry in Japan after World War II. Some of the ideas that we take from him as we work with our customers and talk to other people is, one, we want to source parts from fewer and better suppliers. We want to make sure that the stuff that you're using, and you may not think about it, but we do have a software supply chain inside of our organizations. We have components coming in, and in a lot of cases, this is going to be the open source components that we're leveraging. But what do we know about them? Do we have any insight into what those suppliers are? What's their record on being able to to respond quickly to vulnerabilities that are discovered in their code? How quickly do they update the dependencies that they use in their code? So to me, that's part of the things that indicate the quality of the suppliers that we're looking for. Use only the highest quality parts. Part of what we can do for our customers is be able to show them, oh, you're using this particular component, it's got these vulnerabilities on it, but if you move down maybe 2, 3, 4, 5 versions newer, there are no vulnerabilities in it, and so you can easily remove from yourself that particular component and the vulnerabilities that you've got there and be able to make sure you're using those highest quality parts throughout that. Never pass known defects downstream. We've probably all heard about the Toyota manufacturing process where they can pull the cord, was it the Kaizen cord, be able to stop production and fix a problem. Anybody have that in your build processes? Cool. I see one head nodding. I've got some lights out there, so it's a little hard for me to see what's out there. And that's one of the things that we can do. We can plug into the processes you've got and add that governance, that automated governance to be able to say, hey, there's an issue with this. Stop the process. Fix it now before we send it downstream. That would have been good for, well, if I go back a little bit, I'm not going to take the slide back, but if we were to step back a few bits and talk a little bit about that automation and the DevOps methodology of building out your infrastructure, that probably would have helped Equifax because they wouldn't have had that 18 to 19 months of a bad SSL or an expired SSL certificate on those network on that network equipment that was looking at the traffic. They would have been able to say, let's just redeploy that with a valid certificate, and it would have been much easier to avoid that particular issue and probably saved a lot of pain and trouble for them as well. So source parts from fewer and better suppliers. Use only the highest quality parts. Never pass defects downstream, so be able to pull that cord and stop that whole process. And finally, continuously track location of every part. Now, when you think about your automobile, yeah, we're in Detroit, right? So let's talk about that. When you've got a recall, Ford, GM, Chrysler, whoever is able to say, send you a postcard and say, your vehicle has a bad, I don't know, airbag, ignition switch, something like that. You need to bring it in and get it fixed. They don't send it to everybody. They only send it to the people who have a vehicle that's impacted by that. They know where each and every part has gone. Now, in your software, do you know that? Do you have a bill of materials that shows you each and every open source component that's inside your application and which of those applications have that? Wouldn't it be nice to be able to do that? So those are a lot of the things that we've picked up from Edwards Deming, and we look at that and say, this is very critical for you in your software supply chain. You have one. You may not realize you have one. You may not be aware of how you're managing it, but you do have one. And I was talking about hygiene earlier. One of the things I wanted to bring up is that anybody familiar with the OWASP top 10 things? One of those top 10 things is using known vulnerable components. That goes back to that hygiene of being, that I showed that chart earlier of the download levels of that Struts 2 component. We continue today to see high levels of that component being downloaded, yet we should know better. So I want to encourage each of you to figure out how can you be able to have that good hygiene to make sure that what you're downloading is good and you're using those good components in the beginning of that whole process. Going back, kind of beating that automation drum again, the DevOps process. If you look at organizations that have no DevOps process versus those that are more mature, you can see a high level of integration of security practices from start to finish. Working with the design and architecture, so working with your developers up front, helping them to know what are good components, what are bad components, and then all the way through that development process, all the way into production use where you can do that daily monitoring. Again, I go back to that phrase, open source ages like milk, not like wine. So even after you've got the application built and it's out there and it's running in production use, you still need to be monitoring it so that if something like the Struts 2 comes up again, you'll know exactly which applications you need to go off and fix and take care of. So I'll finish up with a few final words from Jamil. By the way, after their breach, they went through a significant process of picking different vendors, and we are now one of their vendors to be able to come in and help them protect themselves from these type of actions that are out there. So some of the key points that he ended his talk with was automation. Take advantage of that wherever you can, whether it's building out your infrastructure, deploying your applications, building your applications, make sure that you're taking care of that automation and being able to stop that process at any point when something bad is out there. Don't pass those defects downstream. Awareness. Know what's happening in your environment. Be aware of when things don't look right and take actions around those things. And then assurance, because you're doing all those right things and you've got good partners that you're working with that can give you good data to make sure you know what you're working with, you know your components. That's really where it comes through on that. I'm going to finish with a different story from Equifax. It happens to be one of our customers. They were a customer at the time of the breach when the Struts 2 vulnerability was discovered. Fannie Mae. Do you think they might have some PII information that we would want protected? Yeah, I do think so. When that vulnerability was discovered, they went into their systems. Using our tools, they were able to identify which of their applications were using struts. They took a quick look at those. It was just a matter of a few clicks to be able to go through and find that information. They looked at that. They found the applications that were using struts 2, and said, this is bad. We want to stop this. So indeed, they did. They looked at the application and said, we don't know how to fix this right now, but this is so bad, we can't let this happen. So they actually took those servers offline and kept them offline until they knew how to fix it and resolve that issue. And so that's what they did. And because they were using good hygiene, they had good practices, they knew where each and every component was throughout their whole process, they were able to protect themselves, and they weren't one of those big bubbles on that screen that represents a hack. So. Hope this was helpful for you guys. If you have any questions, please come up and ask me. We'll be back in the vendor area. And so thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul. Does anyone have a question for Paul? One question here.
If people are still downloading that Struts 2 vulnerability, why is the organizations that hold them allowing it to happen? Why wouldn't they remove it from the server?
So that's a good question. To repeat the question is that if people are continuing to download those bad components, why do organizations such as Maven Central or the NPM repositories and such continue to leave them out there? And I think that's a valid question. It's something that we as an organization have had debates about. And for whatever reason, I've not participated in those debates, and it's not been something that they've asked my opinion on. But they have left those out there because people have built processes that actually pull those down, and that would suddenly break those processes, and they deemed that was a lesser evil than leaving them up there. Again, I don't know why that decision was made, but that is a decision that was made, and that's why, technically, why they're still out there. But I love the question. Thank you.
Maybe we can make the vulnerable libraries take 10 minutes to download so the builds take a lot longer.
There you go. Great idea.
Any more questions? OK, so let's give Paul another round. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.